Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna. Today we are reading Srimad Bhagavad-Gita as it is, chapter number 4, entitled Transcendental Knowledge, text number 27. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagno juvate jnana dipite. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogyagno juvati jnana dipite. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagno juvati jnana dipite. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagno juvati jnana dipite. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagno juvati jnana dipite. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagno juvati jnana dipite. Sarvani, of all, Indriya, the senses, Karmani, functions, Prana Karmani, functions of the life breath, Cha, also, Appare, others, Atma Samyama, of controlling the mind, Yoga, the linking process, Agno, in the fire of, Juvati, offer, Jnana Dipite, because of the urge for self-realization. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Others who are interested in achieving self-realization through control of the mind and senses offer the functions of all the senses and of the life breath as oblations into the fire of the controlled mind. Please repeat. Others who are interested in achieving self-realization through control of the mind and senses offer the functions of all the senses and of the life breath as oblations into the fire of the controlled mind. Purport. The yoga system conceived by Patanjali is referred to herein. In the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, the soul is called Pratyag Atma and Parag Atma. As long as the soul is attached to sense enjoyment, it is called Parag Atma. But as soon as the same soul becomes detached from such sense enjoyment, it is called Pratyag Atma. The soul is subjected to the functions of the 10 kinds of air at work within the body, and thus is perceived through the breathing system. The Patanjali system of yoga instructs one on how to control the functions of the body's air in a technical manner, so that ultimately all the functions of the air within become favorable for purifying the soul of material attachment. According to this yoga system, Pratyag Atma is the ultimate goal. This Pratyag Atma is withdrawn from activities in material matter. The senses interact with the sense objects, like the ear for hearing, eyes for seeing, nose for smelling, tongue for tasting, and hand for touching. And all of them are thus engaged in activities outside the self. They are called the functions of the prana vayu. The apana vayu goes downward. Vyana vayu acts to shrink and expand. Samana vayu adjusts equilibrium. Udana vayu goes upwards. And when one is enlightened, one engages all these in searching for self-realization. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshuran Maritam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandayaham Sri Guruho Sri Yuta Padakamalam Sri Guruna Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sakrijatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Visakhan Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namustate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Site Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swamin Iti Namani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Vastyatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So last week we were speaking on the verse that introduced these, that summarized these. Verse number 24, where it's described that all these processes described here by Krishna are significant because the goal of all of them is transcendental knowledge. Keshi Damana Prabhu in his class on Thursday mentioned the fact that it was important to discuss these different forms of approaching self-realization, because each of us have different natures, and that we should be engaged in our devotional service according to our nature. Not all of us will be wonderful preachers. Not all of us will be wonderful book distributors. Not all of us will be wonderful pujaris. But all of us have a special relationship with Krishna, which he wants us to develop. And we will develop that through engaging in devotional service. So we need to engage in devotional service according to our nature, at what feels comfortable for us. One senior devotee said in a class several years ago, I think it was, that we don't have to look for challenges in devotional service. What we have to do is become fixed in our service. Krishna will arrange the challenges as we need them to become purified, because this is a process of purification. We might find one service we like very much and we're very comfortable. But to advance in devotional service, we must be challenged to become more than just comfortable. We must be challenged to become fixed in devotional service. So, in the beginning, we find a service that suits our nature, and we become fixed in serving, and we try and develop the attitude of doing everything for Krishna. And by developing that sincere attitude, Krishna will help us. So here in this purport, Srila Prabhupada is explaining some technical terms about Patanjali's system. So I want to just a little bit talk about Patanjali, because it's sometimes easy for us to dismiss everything that's not bhakti-yoga as if it's not important. But of course Krishna put it here in the Bhagavad-Gita because we can learn something from it. We'll get to that a little later. First, Patanjali. No, we'll go first. So, in the Vedic systems, you will have heard of 6 darshans, which are 6 exalted transcendentalists who viewed the Vedas through their own thinking. They're not all about pure devotional service, but they are great philosophers, and their theories have some value. So this is from Srila Prabhupada. There are many theoretical philosophers in the world who put forward their own theories of cause and effect, especially about the cause of suffering and its effect on the different living beings. Generally, there are 6 great philosophers. Kanada, the author of Vaisheshika philosophy. Gautama, the author of logic. Patanjali, the author of mystic yoga. Kapila, the author of the Sankhya philosophy. And Jaimini, the author of Karma Mimamsa. And Vyasadeva, the author of Vedanta Darshan. So in the Bhagavatam, when we're discussing the story of Kardama Muni and how he perfected his devotional practice, in purport there, Prabhupada talks a little bit about Patanjali. The realization of the personal form of the Lord is the highest perfectional stage of yoga. In the 6th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, where the yoga practice is described, This realization of the personal form of the Lord is called the perfection of yoga. After practicing the sitting postures and other regulative principles of the system, one finally reaches the stage of samadhi, absorption in the Supreme. In this samadhi stage, one can see the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his partial form as Paramatma, or as he is. Samadhi is described in the authoritative yoga scriptures such as the Patanjali Sutras to be transcendental pleasure. The yoga system described in the books of Patanjali is authoritative, and the modern so-called yogis who have manufactured their own ways, not consulting the authorities, are simply ludicrous. The Patanjali yoga system is called Ashtanga yoga. Sometimes impersonalists pollute the Patanjali yoga system because they are monist. Patanjali describes that the soul is transcendently pleased when he meets the soul, supersoul, and sees him. If the existence of the supersoul in the individual soul is admitted, then impersonalist theory and monism is nullified. Therefore, some impersonalists and void philosophers twist the Patanjali system in their own way and pollute the whole yoga process. So Prabhupada is describing that Patanjali system is an authoritative process. It's about meeting the supersoul and realizing the supersoul. So spiritual realization is called Kaivalya. Patanjali used the term spiritual power. One gets spiritual power he called Chit Shakti. Somewhere else, if I find it, his verse is described. This Chit Shakti, spiritual power, when one realizes one's relationship with the supersoul. So now we've come to the purport, where Prabhupada talks about these terms, Pratyag Atma and Parag Atma. So I looked up the meaning of these words, pratyag, which is actually pratyak. Now, somebody knows somewhere else in the Bhagavad-Gita where the word pratyak comes up, one of the famous slokas, as part of a compound word in one of the slokas. No? Pratyaksha vagamam dharamyam susukam kartam avyayam, which is 9.2. Raja Vidya Raja Guyam Pavitram Idamutamam Pratyaksha Vagamam Dharmyam Susukam Kartam Avyayam. This knowledge is the king of education. The most secret of all secrets, it is the purest knowledge because it gives direct perception of the self by realization. So in this sloka, they're using pratyaksha, which means direct experience. The word pratyak means direct. It also is sometimes translated as all-pervading, or sometimes pratyak is translated simply as the supersoul. Pratyak means we're facing the supersoul. We're directly experiencing the supersoul. Whereas this word parag means we're turning away from the supersoul. We're turning away from Krishna. So here in the purport is described that as long as the soul is attached to sense enjoyment, it is called parag atma, which means that it's facing away from Krishna. It's facing away from the supersoul, and it's engaged in material activities. So Prabhupada sometimes translates parag as turning away, and sometimes as material. But as soon as the same soul becomes detached from sense enjoyment, it is called pratyak atma, which means it is realizing the supersoul. It is facing the Supersoul and realizing its relationship. So that's also our goal in bhakti-yoga, to realize the Supreme, to realize our position and our relationship with Him. So Prabhupada also talks about the 10 kinds of ears. Because the soul is the living symptom within the body, and because the prana, the life air, is also the living symptom. This is why Prabhupada says the soul is subjected to the functions of the 10 kinds of air at work within the body, and this is perceived through the breathing system. So the soul and the life air are in some ways related, because if one leaves the body, the other is also leaving the body. If the soul is leaving the body, then the life force, the life air is also leaving. So in that way they're sometimes seen together. But we'll just go through the 10 types of air, which is from another purport of Srila Prabhupada's. I think in the Bhagavatam somewhere. Prabhupada explains these 10 types of air in more detail, how they actually work. The movements of the body are first generated from the heart, and all the activities of the body are made possible by the senses, powered by the 10 kinds of air within the body. The 10 kinds of air are described as follows. The main air passing through the nose in breathing is called prana. So Prabhupada also equates this prana with the activities of the senses being external to the body. The air which passes through the rectum as evacuated bodily air is called apana. The air which adjusts the foodstuff within the stomach and which sometimes sounds as belching is called samana. So Prabhupada had described that as adjusting equilibrium. The air which passes through the throat and the stoppage of which constitutes suffocation is called the udana air. And the total air which circulates throughout the entire body is called the vyana air. So these are the 5 principal airs in the body. Subtler than these 5 airs, there are others also. That which facilitates the opening of the eyes, mouth, etc. is called naga air. The air which increases the appetite is called krikara air. The air which helps contraction is called the kurma air. The air which helps relaxation by opening the mouth wide in yawning is called devadatta air. And the air which helps the sustenance is called dhananjaya air. All these airs are generated from the center of the heart, which is one only. The central energy is the superior energy of the Lord, who is seated within the heart, with the soul of the body, who acts under the guidance of the Lord. So this is a relationship between the soul and the ears. The soul is in the heart, and along with the direction of the supersoul is guiding these 10 different ears. So running this material body is rather a complicated process. We don't need to know all of it. The significance of knowing about this system is in actually understanding how powerful are these the forces of the senses, and how it's not just a simple thing to control the senses. There's a nice bit here in this purple. Prabhupada quotes again from Bhagavad-Gita 15:15 about the supersoul. Sarvasya chaham hridhi sanivishtu mata smritir jnanam apohanam cha Vedashta Sevairaham eva Veju, Vedanta Krit, Veda Vid eva Chaham. So quoting that, Lord Krishna has says, he's situated in the heart. He's the source of remembrance, forgetfulness. So it's the Lord situated in the heart as the super soul who helps us. One who wants to continue to forget the Lord is helped by the Lord, to forget him birth after birth. But one who remembers him by dint of association with a devotee of the Lord is helped to remember him more and more. Thus the conditioned soul can ultimately go back home, back to Godhead. Okay. So Krishna says an understanding of this process of mechanical restraint of the senses, good to understand. Prabhupada gave class on this verse, and he stressed the importance of the distinction between bhakti-yoga and this type of mechanical yoga. This type of yoga is described in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita. Actually, the whole 6th chapter makes very nice reading about how the goal of yoga, as described in this verse, is to control the mind. We control the life airs of the body, we control the senses in order to control the mind. I'd like to briefly go through some of these verses in the 6th chapter, and then we'll have a little look at what Prabhupada said in his class on this verse. So in the beginning, Krishna is saying that actually the yogi is one who is not attached to the fruits of his work, not just the one who sits still and does no duty. What is called renunciation, you should know to be the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme, O son of Pandu. For one can never become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. So this important thing about the control of the mind. In the modern day, they think that yoga is simply performing the exercises, and they don't know about the importance of controlling the mind. But here Lord Krishna is stressing how one cannot become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. Unless he controls his mind. Text 5 says, one must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy at will. For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friend. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. For one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. So this is very much equating the difference between parag, or external view, and pratyak. When we control the mind and can face inward toward the super soul, Krishna is saying that the super soul is already reached. To such a man, happiness and distress, heat and cold, honor and dishonor are all the same. So Krishna explains this system, how difficult it is. Prabhupada explains in the purport how difficult it is in this age of Kali to go to a secluded place, let alone anything else, and sit and meditate. In the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, when Gopakumar goes up to I think it's the highest planets in this planetary system, he meets the great yogis and they have a discussion. the great yogis are saying that the perfection is meditation. That when one can meditate, one doesn't need to engage the senses. One can simply meditate. And I forget who replies, who gives the other side of the story. Who was with Gopakumar? I forget. Anyway, the reply given is that when we are perfected, meditation is fine. At that time, we are no longer engaged in the senses, and we can meditate. But for us as sadhakas, this chanting is the best process. This engagement in devotional service is the best process, because we are engaging our senses. And by engaging our senses, it will cultivate control of the mind. So when we are engaged in activities of devotional service, we are following the process, the process of sadhana. But if we falsely think we are elevated and try to meditate, and our mind wanders, then actually we have nothing. We're just, as Prabhupada says, being ludicrous. We've gained nothing at all. But for us as sadhakas, we have no loss to engage in devotional service, because if we take up this process of hearing and chanting, the chanting out loud will lead to us also hearing, which will purify us, Chaito Darpana Marjanam. And this process will take us into perfection. So we can't artificially become a yogi, become a full renunciate. When the yogi, by practice of yoga, disciplines his mental activities and becomes situated in transcendence, devoid of all material desires, he is said to be well established in yoga. So Prabhupada, in the 6th chapter, he again talks about Patanjali a little bit, in these verses 6:20 to 23, which describe the perfection of this yoga system. In the stage of perfection called trance or samadhi, one's mind is completely restrained from mental activities by practice of yoga. This perfection is characterized by one's ability to see the self by the pure mind and to relish and rejoice in the self. In that joyous state, one is situated in boundless transcendental happiness, realized through the transcendental senses. So this is this description of Patanjali's spiritual happiness. Established thus, when one never departs from the truth, and upon gaining this he thinks there is no greater gain. Being situated in such a position, one is never shaken, even in the midst of the greatest difficulty. This indeed is actual freedom from all miseries arising from the material contact. So here in the purport, Prabhupada talks a little bit about Samadhi and Patanjali. Yoga practice is more or less based on the principles of the Patanjali system. Some unauthorized commentators try to identify the individual soul with the supersoul, and the monists think this to be liberation. But they do not understand the real purpose of the Patanjali system of yoga. There is an acceptance of transcendental pleasure in the Patanjali system, but the monists do not accept this transcendental pleasure out of fear of jeopardizing their theory of oneness. Here's this quote from Patanjali, the famous exponent of the yoga system. The Yoga Sutras, Purushata Sunyanan Gunanan Pratiprashavaha Kaivalyam Swarupa Pratishta Va Chitti Shakti Iti. This Chitti Shakti, or internal potency, is transcendental. Purushartha means religiosity, economic development, sense gratification, and at the end, the attempt to be one with the Supreme. According to Patanjali, this Kaivalyam is an internal transcendental potency by which the living entity becomes aware of his constitutional position. In the words of Lord Chaitanya, the state of affairs is called Chaito Darpana Marjanam, or clearance of the impure mirrors of the mind. This clearance is actually liberation, Bhava Maha Davagni Nirvapana. The theory of nirvana is also preliminary and corresponds with this principle. So towards the end of this 6th chapter, Lord Krishna explains, first we have Arjuna saying that this system is impossible, how difficult yoga is. Arjuna listens to this whole description of yoga, and then he says, but we can't practice yoga because to control the mind is more difficult than controlling the wind. So this is something that we need to realize, the actual difficulty of controlling the mind. The conclusion of this 6th chapter, Yoginam api sarvesham matgatenantaratmana Shradavam bhajate yomam sa me yuktatamo mataha. And of all the yogis, the one with great faith, who always abides in me, thinks of me within himself, and renders transcendental loving service to me, he is the most intimately united with me in yoga, and he is the highest of all. That is my opinion. So Krishna is glorifying bhakti-yoga, devotional service. The one with great faith, who always abides in me, thinks of me within himself and renders transcendental loving service to me. So this is also the point that Prabhupada is making when he gives class on this verse. In the last 2 lines of the Sanskrit, the word jnana dipite in the word for word, Prabhupada says, because of the urge for self-realization. When one is enlightened, jnana dipite, the light of knowledge is awakened, then atma samyamaya yogino, the controlling of senses and offering in the fire of yoga. So this transcendental knowledge, as we've described since last week, is the goal of all these systems. Jnana dipite is in today's verse. So when we get this transcendental knowledge, then we can offer everything into the fire of controlled senses and controlled mind. So Prabhupada makes the point in his class how bhakti yoga is different from artificially controlling the mind and senses, because instead of trying to restrict the senses, it gives engagement to the senses, because the senses are active. He gives the example how it's just like a child. The mind is just like a child. Sometimes a child will accept something, sometimes a child will reject something. And the child acts instantly, yes I want, no I don't want. So the mind is like that. That actually is the role of the mind, simply to accept and reject. The intelligence does some analysis, but the mind is simply, I like, I don't like, just like the child. The child acts spontaneously on that system. It's called sankalpa vikalpa. Sometimes accepting, sometimes rejecting. So he says that Arjuna was like this. Arjuna's mind was like this. What you're asking me to do, I don't want to do, because you're asking me to kill my family members. I don't want to do it. It's not possible. So Prabhupada says, so it's actually very difficult to control the mind. Even great munis like Vishvamitra and Sobari munis. So Vishvamitra, he was meditating for 60,000 years. And after that, one society girl called Menaka simply walked past, heard the ankle bells, and his meditation was broken. The other one, Subari Muni, he was meditating under the water because he didn't want his senses to be disturbed. But he happened to see two fish mating, and his senses became disturbed. So immediately he came out, he wanted to satisfy his senses, and he married not one, but he married all the king's daughters. So that's how strong the senses are. So we shouldn't take lightly this process of control of the senses and control of the mind. So Prabhupada comes back to the verse, Atma Samyama Yogagno. Samyama means control. The mind is the principal sense. Indriyani paranyahur indriyabhya parambanaha. This is the verse at the end of the 3rd chapter, which says that the senses are superior to dull matter, but the mind is superior to the senses. The mind is central to the senses. Prabhupada says, just like a madman, because he cannot fix up his mind, he cannot work properly. Therefore, he is a madman. So our process is that we cannot control the mind. But if we engage the mind on the lotus feet of Krishna, then everything will be controlled. Krishna will help. If some way or other you can engage your mind at the lotus feet of Krishna, Savai Mana Krishna Padara Vindayor, then gradually everything can be controlled. So we're understanding the difficulty of controlling the tongue. Also in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu there is another verse, Savonmukhi Jivado, we'll go there. Ata Sri Krishna Namadi Nabhavet Grayamindriyahi Savonmukhe Jivado Svayam Eva Spurajadaha. No one can understand the transcendental nature of the name, form, quality and pastimes of Sri Krishna through his materially contaminated senses. Only when one becomes spiritually saturated by transcendental service to the Lord are the transcendental name, form, quality and pastimes of the Lord revealed to him. This is Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1-2-234. So our process is to engage the material senses in order to purify them. In that way, the senses can be controlled. They cannot be controlled any other way. So, Sevonmukhe Jivado, beginning with the tongue, because the tongue is described as the most powerful of the senses. Bhaktivinoda Thakur says in our Prasadam song, Sarirya Bijajal, our senses are a network of ignorance. Prabhupada says, it's just like you're bound in a net and thrown in the ocean. How do you think you'll survive? So we have to control our senses, but we don't control artificially, but we control. The devotees, Prabhupada says, are trained not to allow the tongue to touch anything except Krishna Prasada. But we can still satisfy the tongue very nicely. We don't go to restaurants and we don't go out and buy other things simply to satisfy the tongue. But we can enjoy Krishna Prasadam. And also we can control by the tongue from vibrating, by not talking about anything except Krishna. Prabhupada says simply these two things: controlling the tongue to eat nothing but Krishna Prasad, and controlling it to speak nothing but Hare Krishna. Then you become the greatest yogi. Prabhupada says, of course, we cannot simply control our senses. We have to maintain the body, we have to eat. But we can eat Krishna's prasadam. So another verse in the 15th chapter. Mamai vamsa jiva loke, jiva bhuta sanatana, mana shastran indriyani, prakriti stani karshati. In this verse, Lord Krishna explains Mamai vamsa jiva loke. In this material world, every living entity is actually my fragmental part and parcel. They're eternal, jiva bhuta sanatana, but mana shashtan indriyani prakriti stani karshati. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So it's not so easy to control the senses. We have to take up this process that's given to us by Rupa Goswami. Ata Shri Krishna Namadi Nabhavet Graham Indriyahi. We receive knowledge through our senses, but when our senses are impure, they cannot understand what is Krishna. But devotional service begins by hearing, by shravanam. Prabhupada quotes another from Bhagavad-Gita, 9:14. Satatam kirtayanto mam yatantas cha dridavrataha namasyantas cha mam bhakja nicha yukta upasate. So he says, these are great souls, always chanting my glories, endeavoring with great determination, bowing down before me. These great souls perpetually worship me with devotion. So this is our process of devotional service. The previous verse had described these great souls. 9:13. Mahatmanas tu mam parita, devim prakritim ashritaha, bhajantyananya manaso, gyatva bhutabdim avdyayam. O son of Pritha, those who are not deluded, the great souls, are under the protection of the divine nature. They are fully engaged in devotional service because they know me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, original and inexhaustible. So this determination to engage our senses properly in Krishna's service must come with this understanding that Krishna is giving here in the Bhagavad-Gita, how difficult it is to control the mind and senses, and how we actually need to become regulated. All these verses from 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. 29 describes a whole lot of them. These are all about regulating our activities, following the processes that have been recommended in the Veda. And also Burijan Prabhu explains in his commentaries how all these processes have transcendental knowledge as their goal. So after that, Krishna will will go on to explain how this knowledge is so important. All these performers who know the meaning of sacrifice. So we must know this meaning of sacrifice. As I explained last week, if we don't understand the meaning of what we're doing, we might do it for some time and then we'll do something else because we're not satisfied. Or else we'll do it for, we'll take up a sacrifice because we'll get something out of it. Krishna says, all these performers who know the meaning of sacrifice become cleansed of sinful reactions. So this transcendental knowledge is important for the cleansing, for Chaitodarpanam. And having tasted the nectar of the results of sacrifice, they advanced towards the supreme eternal atmosphere. O best of the Kuru dynasty, without sacrifice one can never live happily on this planet or in this life. What then of the next? All of these different types of sacrifice are approved by the Vedas, and all of them are born of different types of work. Knowing them as such, you will be liberated. So this born of different types of work. Sacrifice comes from doing one's duty, born of work. It's not about doing something different. Sacrifice is about the purpose for which we do our work. We do our work for our duty, and when we engage in devotional service, we do it for the pleasure of Krishna, because he's given us these activities. O chastiser of the enemy, the sacrifice performed in knowledge is better than mere sacrifice of material possessions. After all, O son of Pritha, all sacrifices of work culminate in transcendental knowledge. So then Lord Krishna gives us the process by which we attain transcendental knowledge. Tad vidi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattvadashinaha. Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized souls can impart knowledge unto you because they have seen the truth. So all these different processes are given, and they're given with the goal of transcendental knowledge. But to carry them out properly, we need the guidance of the spiritual master. He will engage us properly according to our propensities, and he will make sure we learn the truth. But we must approach him in this proper mood. We must approach him in a submissive spirit. We must render service from him, and we must inquire from him. And then he will be inclined to give us this transcendental knowledge. And transcendental knowledge is described in text 35. Having obtained real knowledge from a self-realized soul, you will never again fall into such illusion. For by this knowledge you will see that all living entities are but part of the Supreme, or in other words, they are mine. So this is our fruit of transcendental knowledge, to understand our position in relationship with Krishna. And then we can enter into devotional service. So at this point I'll stop and ask if there are any comments or questions in relation to today's class.
Mataji, there is a question, like the name is told in devotional service, hearing is very important.
Yes.
And the most important. Will you explain the why hearing is most important?
Why hearing is most important?
Yeah.
Hearing is, in the 9 processes, it's the very first. So Prabhupada explains how these, what are given as the first 3, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, are the most important. They're given first. And it's the most basic process. It's described through the nectar of devotion, how this hearing accompanies all 9 processes are not complete without hearing. It's so important that it's involved in all 9 processes. So, say for example, if you engaged in worshipping the deity, this process of deity worship, if you're following the regulations, rules and regulations, you're chanting mantras, you're chanting and you're hearing. Because any other process, we're engaging our material senses. And if we don't follow the regulative principles, if we don't get to the transcendental platform, it's merely sentimental. So in this material world, there's a verse which I don't know exactly, but it describes how Krishna's holy name is descended from Goloka Vrindavan. It is actually transcendental. So in this material world, that holy name is transcendental. But anything else we engage in, if we try not to engage the holy name as well, we're simply using the material senses. So that much importance is there on the hearing process. This hearing, Prabhupada gives a material analogy in one place. He says, suppose a man is sleeping. The best way to wake him up is by shouting at him. His hearing, the sense of hearing, is active even when he's sleeping. But he won't see anything. Sometimes he won't feel anything. The hearing process is the most powerful. But it's also the one that will take us to the transcendental platform. Provided, of course, we engage sincerely. But this name is transcendental. Yes, Prabhu? Yeah.
I wanted to add, but by any other process alone, we cannot achieve success in our age. So, for example, this yoga is described here by using transcendental knowledge. We cannot get to Krishna. By using yoga and by taking to austerities, we cannot take to Krishna because we are too fallen. This is the quality of the age. So Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, by chanting the holy name, which is Krishna himself, because the name is absolute as the Lord himself, we get purified. And then by the mercy of holy name, we become eligible to following these processes, because otherwise we simply cannot.
Thank you.
There is another question we were just discussing. Start the devotional service, and after different time become fixed in that.
Yes.
Do you explain what do you mean by become fixed? Do you mean like the 9 processes, Shraddha, Sadhusam, Bhajan-kriya, Anartha, Nishtha? Is it the stage of Nishtha or the stage of Asakti when one becomes fixed in devotional service?
Well, in the Nectar of Instruction, Rupa Goswami gives the qualities important for devotional service. Utsahan Nischayat Daryat. Enthusiasm, patience, and determination. So in the beginning, we must develop that determination. We don't have to worry so much whether we've attained Nishtha or not. We have to develop some faith in the instructions of the spiritual master. Prabhupada even made the comment, I may not be perfect, but the process I follow is perfect. So we have to take these words of the spiritual master and we have to develop faith in these words. And that will help us. We have to cultivate utsahan nischayat daryat. Enthusiasm, confidence, and patience, determination like that, by association with devotees who have these qualities. Then we'll become fixed. We don't need to worry too much about analyzing what state we're at. We really need to take this process and become fixed in it. Sometimes the devotees will go here and there trying to find a better process. Some of them will go outside the gates, and they will go to the Goswami temples, they will concentrate on doing lots of parikramas. They might think, perhaps I need to chant more rounds. But actually, this is the chanchala mind. This is the mind trying to find something better. We need to fix our minds on the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada and follow his instructions. As Prabhupada was saying, in this age we're so fallen, we actually have no qualification. Prabhupada never claimed any qualification himself, even though he did so much. In 12 years he established 108 temples. In 1 year alone, between 1971 and 1972, he established about more than 30 temples. It's quite incredible when you actually look at what he did. But he said, actually, if I deserve any credit, it's simply that I've tried to follow the instructions of my spiritual master. So, when we find our mind trying to find a better process, trying to think, perhaps if I do this it'll be better, perhaps if I do that it'll be better, we need to just look at that mind. Because what we're getting at by studying this section on controlling the mind is very difficult to control. And we often forget how close the mind is to us. We sometimes forget that the mind is material. One thing that I was struck by was in this verse 241. Vyavasayatmika buddhir ekehe kurunandana bahu shaka hyanantascha buddhayo avyavasayinam. Those who are on this path are resolute in purpose, and their aim is one. O beloved child of the Kurus, the intelligence of those who are irresolute is many-branched. So sometimes when we keep looking for another process, or we're not satisfied with our service and we want another service, it's our mind being irresolute. If we can develop faith in Srila Prabhupada giving us this perfect process, and understand Krishna will give everything else to us. Whatever we need, he can provide. We might think we're doing a completely insignificant service. We might think we're doing a boring service. How can we ever attain a perfection by doing a boring service? But Krishna can provide everything that we need, even in the most simplest of services. So it's not so much we have to attain a level, it's we have to take this much control of our mind and say, Prabhupada said at one point, I've given away so many millions and millions of lives. Let me just give this one life to Krishna completely. Let me follow this process, this life. Let me control the mind, at least. Any further comments and questions? Okay, thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Jagadguru Sri Prabhupada ki jai.